What was Freud's theory for our minds? How did he understand the human mind? Well, I've already given away some of it. For Freud, a really important part of our mind was our unconscious mind. That is, the part of our thinking and feeling and desires and fears that we're not consciously aware of. The unconscious mind. The parts that we are aware of, he called the conscious mind. It's a relatively small proportion of our thoughts and feelings. And Freud used an iceberg as an analogy to give you a sense of conscious versus unconscious minds. So in this iceberg analogy, anything that's below water is unconscious. You can't see it. Now the thing about icebergs is there's always more ice below the water than there is above the water. So that's why he used an iceberg analogy to bring home the message that most of our mind is underwater. We're not consciously aware of it. For Freud, there were three levels or three forces in your mind. The id, the ego, and the superego. And you'll need to know those, so we'll spend a little bit of time on them. The id is basically your unconscious desires and wants and needs. It's motivated by something called the pleasure principle, which is essentially whatever I want it now. That's the id. So a lot of times you'll see drawings of the id in which the id is represented as a little devil, the little devil inside of you. Freud thought that the id was what was responsible for our Freudian slips, that when we say forgot someone's birthday, it was our id saying, oh, I really hate that person, forget the birthday. The next little being is the ego. And the ego's job is to manage this crazy id that wants everything it wants and wants it right now with the third element, which is a superego. And the superego is the most moral side of yourself. Your superego is the part of your mind that says, no, don't do that, that's wrong. Or do this, that's what good people do. So your superego you can think of as your conscience. It's the internalized rules from your society, from your culture, the part of you that tells you how you should behave. Whereas the id is the part of you that tells you what you want to do. And the ego is stuck in the middle, trying to balance the wants and desires of these two, the id and the superego, these two conflicting energies, because they usually want different things. So let's combine the id, the ego, and the superego with Freud's iceberg analogy. And the drawing here pretty much covers it. So remember, the ego is the part of you that's trying to manage your crazy id and your crazy superego. And about half of that in Freud's mind is conscious. We're consciously aware of this need to balance our own wants and desires with the rules that our society has created for us. And the superego, which is our morality, our conscience, a significant chunk of that is above water. We all know what our society tells us are the rules for good behavior and bad behavior. But most of the superego is below water. It's unconscious. Most of the pressure that we feel from society's norms are functioning at an unconscious level. But remember, there were three sort of little critters running around in Freud's theory. And the first one was the id. I want it and I want it now. For Freud, all of the id is unconscious. And it's a big chunk of the iceberg. I want to spend a little time talking about each of these levels of being in Freud's theory of our mind. So let's start with the id. The id is something you're born with. It's the little baby who wants what it wants and wants it now and doesn't care about the repercussions of its own desires or the repercussions of its desires for anyone else, right? The thing about little babies is they think the world revolves around them, and that's basically your id. So your id is your unconscious mind. It's present at birth, and all it cares about is what you want right now. And that's called the pleasure principle. So the id functions according to the pleasure principle. And the pleasure principle is about immediate gratification. I want what I want, and I want it right now. And if you think about brand new babies, that's what they're like. They don't think about the fact that their parents are exhausted from staying up all night because they cried. It's not part of their understanding of the world. So you can think of the id as sort of biological instincts, right? I'm hungry, so I want to eat food. The id would say, so I want that food right now. Or I need exercise. I feel like going out and playing, so I want to do that right now, regardless of the consequences for anybody else. That's the id. The ego, Freud thought, started after about a year of life. And the ego's job is to find reasonable and socially acceptable ways of satisfying both the id and the superego. And the ego is all about reality. It's like, listen, buddies, if the ego is talking to the id and the superego, I have to deal with the constraints as they are on the ground now, so just pipe down. You can think of the ego as sort of the boss of your brain or the executive in control, but it's constantly stuck, according to Freud, battling the conflicting demands of the id and the superego. So your superego is like your moral compass, except it also includes aspects of your moral compass that you're not even aware of. I really like this picture of Bart Simpson because it demonstrates the classic depiction of the id and the superego and the ego in the middle. So your id is like the devil on one side of your shoulder, that devilish sort of you, and the superego is like an angel on the other side of your other shoulder telling you what you should do. So the id is what I want to do, the superego is what I should do, and the ego is stuck in the middle trying to figure out how do I make these both sides happy enough for right now. The superego is all about morality. It operates on the morality principles. That is what your moral compass or what your culture has taught you is the right and wrong way to behave, that's what guides your behavior. And the superego is thought to use defense mechanisms as a way to manage that crazy id. And we'll talk about defense mechanisms soon. But now that you know about the id, the ego, and superego, I can talk about Freudian jokes. Jokes actually played a big role in Freud's theory, as did dreams. He did a lot of dream analysis. He thought dreams were a window into your unconscious. So here's the Freudian joke. The ego and the superego walk into a bar. The bartender says, I'm going to need to see some ID. Id, ID. Ba-dum-bum. Know any Freudian jokes? No, I'm a Freud nut. Freudian slip, somebody falling, Freud falling, slipping on a banana. So in Freudian theories, you'll see a lot of cigars and a lot of bananas, and they're supposed to have these phallic associations. And what does Freud have phallic associations with? His mother. That's a very Freudian concept that we will get to in the last segment on Freud. So come right back and we'll talk about defense mechanisms. Once you know these, you'll spot people using them all the time.